Theme of our discussion today is editorial leadership in an age of disinformation. The question, therefore, let me kick this off by, get straight into the subject and kick this discussion off by raising the point about the role of the editor in the mainstream media to begin with, and the role of the editor when it comes to tackling a peculiar situation that we are faced with today, where there's disinformation waiting around every corner for a journalist. Is the editor a significant entity anymore? Has the digitization of the media, the devolution of the media into the public sphere, the dominance of the social media, all this made the editor redundant on the one hand? Has the fact that media has become bigger and bigger and bigger business, the corporatization of the media, the market paradigm of the media, and the nexus of the ruling class or those in power and the media, and this corporate entity called the media made the editor redundant, is one big question that comes to my mind. But I won't preempt what I'm sure the experts here have to say about this. I'll perhaps start with perhaps Dan, in my immediate right, and ask him what he makes of the role of the editor from his own experience, and perhaps with his experience in the United States and what he's seen in other countries, particularly India. And is the editor a significant entity anymore in the media ecology? And does the editor have a role in countering disinformation?
Thank you. Thank you for that great question, and thank you for having me. And thanks to the U.S. Consulate for supporting the Asian College of Journalism. I'm very honored to be here from the United States. I would tell you that never before has the role of the editor been as important or more important than it is right now. And that is for several reasons. First, not necessarily in this order, but first, because there has to be a champion for free press. There has to be a champion for the journalists who are toiling in the field and toiling on the phone, gathering information, what famous US Watergate-era journalist Carl Bernstein calls finding the best obtainable version of the truth and then reporting that to the public. The role of the editor is paramount in ensuring that a newsroom has a culture that is full of assertive and active journalists who practice the best kind of ethical, responsible journalism possible. The editor has a role not just enforcing those standards, but championing the free press. As I know it's part of the fourth pillar of your Constitution. It's the First Amendment of our Constitution, which guarantees 5 things, including freedom of the press. And it's been throughout history, particularly in the modern history of the United States, going back the last 150 years or so, that the editor or the leader in a newsroom, in the broadcast world we have news directors, and it's always been a paramount feature of a responsible journalism enterprise. And I don't see that fading at all. I see the need for that and the importance of that increasing, particularly in today's era of disinformation and all the political and ideological chasms that exist.
Krishna Prasad, as a former editor of Outlook, the chief editor of Outlook, and in other capacities, would you go along with Dan's view that the editor is, if anything, more important today than ever?
I most certainly will. I think I'll go further forward to suggest that it's not just the editor anymore, actually, who's the gatekeeper. I think every single journalist, every single student journalist, every single wannabe journalist, and every single journalist today is now in the position of a policeman in a news organization, whether it's print, television, or online. I think our role as journalists, forget just as editors, but just as journalists, I think our roles have become far more forensic than ever before. We are now basically forensic scientists, although we are not scientists. We are forensic generalists, if not journalists. So I would actually go so far as to say that even a citizen today has an editorial responsibility in terms of ensuring that what he reads is authentic or not. The truth is that fake news, disinformation, and misinformation is not a 21st century phenomenon. It goes back all the way to the 1st century AD, the 1st century after the birth of Christ, or the BCE as we call it. It goes back all the way back then. So therefore it's not new. It's a constant battle that we journalists have fought over the years since Gutenberg invented the printing press. But I think it's gotten exacerbated in the last few years, and certainly in this century. So I think, to cut the long story short, we certainly have a huge role, but every single journalist has a role in an organization. Every single journalism student has a role going forward, and at the end of it, every single citizen has a role, because this is a huge, huge issue before us.
From what Krishna Prasad and Dan said, the takeaway for me is that the traditional role of journalism, the mainstream media organizations, shall we say, are they relevant anymore? Because they seem to have segued into the social media. Everybody is a journalist, the citizen journalist cliche. Everybody therefore must be his own editor. Every producer of news must be his or her own editor. In such a situation, is journalism, I'm going to go one step further, apart from editor, is journalism itself anything special anymore? I mean, because if social media is what you're tailing, most newsrooms today are tailing social media. And I think the fake news we're speaking about probably are generated in the social media realm more than the mainstream media realm. It's picked up from there and amplified and multiplied in the mainstream media, and certainly there is culpability there. Pratik, would you say that the whole ecology has changed? There's a whole paradigm shift in terms of what journalism is. If each of us is a journalist, why do we need a news organization? Why do we need those structures of sub-editors, copy-editors, except for the language and so on, for some more of form than substantive issues?
So first, briefly, I would want to talk about, here the role of the editor is being discussed. I want to talk about the role of the organization itself. Mr. Krishna Prasad himself has been at the end of doing certain stories and then having to deal with the fallout of doing certain stories. We have seen that in other organizations as well. When we started with Alt News, it was not just about debunking misinformation, but for us it was also an experiment of how to run a media organization. Not that the strategy will work for all media organizations, but how to run a media organization which is devoid of advertisements. We don't have a single advertisement on the website, and where we educate people to fund it. And why? So, for example, we have a fund from a body called IPSMF. It's a Bangalore-based body which has given us a fund for 1 year. Now, that fund has gotten over this month, and we don't get the fund for till October. So we are 3 months without a fund. But I think I would call it as an achievement that this month, when we did crowdfunding, we have crowdfunded salary of every individual in the organization. So we are essentially going to run this 3 months. The aim is to run without a single advertisement, without any investor, completely funded by people doing crowdfunding from social media. So for us, Alt News was also about how to create an organization which can survive the present state of democracy in India, where if you have a big investor, what it also means that the government can go and bully this big investor in and force editorial decisions which an editor which otherwise probably will not take. So I think in the press, at least from the Indian media ecosystem, we also need to rethink the business of media and not just what happens within the newsroom, because I think there's a lot of wrong that is happening as far as the business of media, and that is where I'm sort of quite happy today that I can say that this month all of us at Alt News are going to be paid our salaries from people, from money donated by people, and not from any advertisement, any investors or anything like that.
Right. So what emerges is certainly the journalism, as we've understood it, is in a state of flux. There's a kind of change that's happening, and it's a rapid kind of change, and we need to cope with that. When you're a journalist and you're competing with far more organizations or far more entities today than ever before, because there are online platforms, there are online news portals, and there are hundreds of them. And you need to be out there with the news, along with the rest or ahead of the rest, otherwise you're seen as not doing your work, or, I mean, you're losing out in the race. Where is the time and space to fact check is essentially the point that was raised. And what do you do when others are rushing ahead with the news and you are fact checking and probably find out that's true, in which case you've lost the race, find out it's false, it doesn't make a difference because 20 others have said what's false. What is this all about?
And so the point that was being made that we saw the BBC story about Kashmir, and for alt news it took us about 3 days to fact check it and put it out that the footage that BBC and Al Jazeera presented saying that these are protests that are happening in Sora in Kashmir. These are genuine protests. So we looked at various billboards, etc., that we could see in the video, and then we mapped it to actual locations, and it took us a while to do that. The point that was being made was that there's there's not enough, no journalist in mainstream media will be given that much amount of time, 3 days to go behind a story. But I don't completely buy that argument, because yes, some of the stories do take three days, but there's a lot of stories that we do. And right now there are other organizations who have started fact checking. India Today is fact checking, Jagran is fact checking. I don't completely agree with how they are fact checking, but they are fact checking things. There are some stories which take time, but there are many other stories which can be done in a limited constraint of time. And it is just that I think people don't understand this ecosystem very well, which is why I was trying to show during the session about how Google has incentivized the practice of fact checking by, so that they direct additional traffic to fact checking websites. So he was pointing out, this person was pointing out that they get, X number of visitors per month, but we only do 2 to 3 stories a day. There are organizations which are doing 30, 40, 50 stories a day. Even with 2 to 3 stories a day, I think the average traffic that we get per article is much more than what you get for, a random lifestyle feature story.
Right. So there is merit in fact checking.
Absolutely.
Would you say, Dan, that you have to institutionalize fact checking? For instance, in the US, if I'm not mistaken, this information may be dated. I remember reading about organizations like FAIR, for instance, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, and this acts like a pressure lobby on the mainstream media in order to make sure that what they're putting out is indeed verified and is fact checked and so on. And yet, of course, there is fake news, perhaps not of the order that we have here in the US. Would you say that, there is an understanding of the media that the media, we have to be thick as thieves. You don't point out each other's faults. Do you think, on the contrary, we should actually be calling out misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, deliberately planted information, even if it's by somebody else in the media, and not stand on this solidarity of the media and, this thick of thieves business must be busted?
Well, it's a complicated scenario in the United States. To get to the first part of your question, yes, there are organizations that police the media and the accuracy of reporting, but many of them, if not most of them, do so through a particular ideological lens. There are conservative media watchdog groups that are happy to point out that the media are liberal and hate Republicans and hate God and hate country and all this nonsense. There are people on the left side of the political spectrum who serve as self-appointed watchdogs to the media, and they make similar points from their perspective. There are middle-of-the-road fact-checking organizations, and while there is a sense of camaraderie among journalists at times, and there are times when competing journalism organizations stand up for each other, such as last year when the White House revoked the press credentials of CNN correspondent Jim Acosta. Everybody from the broadcast networks in America to Fox News, which is their opinion host certainly, but they have responsible journalists who work there as well, are certainly in the Trump camp. They came to the defense of CNN's ability to have Jim Acosta credentialed at the White House. So there are times that it's fiercely competitive, right? It's a fiercely competitive environment, but there are times when journalists do come together for a common goal because, you know, in the case of Acosta, if the White House had gotten away with that, then it might be a Fox News reporter next. Or it might be an MSNBC, which is a more left-leaning in terms of their opinion hosts, cable network in the United States, or they might be next. So I don't want to give the impression that we try to have it both ways, because we are fiercely competitive, but there are moments when solidarity is required, and solidarity does in fact exist and come to the rescue.
How would you, Krishna Prasad, see the Indian scenario in this respect? Is there a collusive complicity, shall we say, in the media, when we know that what somebody is saying is fake, is not verified, and yet we don't speak out about it because we are part of the same brotherhood?
Shashi, if I can just take a minute to answer something you asked, Pratik. You know, one of the theories I hold very dear in my mind and heart is that nothing that is happening now is new. Okay? I believe this has been happening for a very long time. So this business of fact-checking, you know, I remember in the late 1980s, a friend of mine who worked for the Reader's Digest magazine, and I'm sure you've seen Reader's Digest magazine, he wrote a piece from India about how it is a bright and sunny morning in Ahmedabad, actually. And there was a fact-checker in the 1980s calling up Ahmedabad to check if it was bright and sunny that morning. Okay? So this is the kind of fact-checking that has gone on for a very long period of time. I hope you know the name of Der Spiegel, one of the world's greatest magazines. Der Spiegel at one point of time had 117 fact-checkers in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So the point is that organizations have always been invested in this. This nonsense that is going on in India is driven by idiot managers. You know, this whole crazy run for eyeballs, viewers, users, etc. has led us into this completely idiotic scene where we are in this mad rush to capture eyeballs. Can anyone tell me what is the one great piece of journalism that has come out from this extraordinary speed of light of journalism? What has really come out of it? Okay, because this is a very good question asked to Pratik, which is what can we in mainstream media organizations do to do this better, to do journalism better? The truth is none of us in Indian journalism are invested in credibility. We are not invested in journalism. We are now invested in a profit motive, which is overriding everything else. And I think that is the sad truth we have to face. We seem to have decided to skip the process of credibility. We don't seem to think credibility is part of our core task. You know, apparently Pratik Sinha's website gets 1.5 lakh people, users a day. Let's assume another website gets 1.5 million users a month. Apparently that's the viewership that a website gets per day. My argument is that the other organization has a greater need, a greater incentive to set up fact-checking and gatekeeping than even Pratik Sinha. You know? So my argument is a very simple one, that unless we in Indian journalism deal with this beast, and it's a real beast properly, this is going to go out of control. We need full-time social media editors, which means not just people who are seeing something on the web and writing a story. You need people who are fact-checking, double-checking, doing all of these things real time. And I think we have failed hugely in this country in some of those processes. And so I did forget the other question.
Yeah, so this collusiveness, I mean, the media.
Yeah, so therefore, so I think this collusion will always be there. It's there in the US, it's there in India, etc. But I think steadily we are breaking out of it. But I think I want to place, before you do, one large ball on this table, which is that in India, one of the more criminal acts you're seeing today, and I call it criminal unequivocally, it's a criminal act, which is that there are organizations, media organizations, which are involved in fabricating news, which are involved in faking news, which are creating fake news, and these are not tiny publications. And I tell you this not as somebody who's taking a high moral stand, but I'm just telling you how sad and criminal the role of journalists has become in the hands of absolutely, what do you say, mercenary owners, mercenary managers, and ideologically driven owners who are concocting news, and this is the lead story in the world's largest read newspaper, and I'm not talking of the Times of India. The world's largest newspaper in the world prints fake news as a matter of course, and we have nothing to say to the rest of the media. We don't have nothing. We in the Editors Guild cannot find the strength to speak up. We in the Indian Newspaper Society cannot find the strength to speak out against this kind of fabrication of news, this kind of absolutely playing with people's sentiments, people's emotions, actually driving people communally crazy. And I think this is a very dangerous thing, which is on the side of the owners, which I'll place before you. The other thing I'll place before you is the role of the state in this country, and I'm sure Shashi will bring it up. But I think the role of the main political parties, and again unequivocally I will say the BJP, in making fake news a part of the system is very, very huge, and I think we have to deal with this very quickly. But as far as the collusion is concerned, I think there is plenty of it. I think some alternate websites are breaking out of it. They're pointing out mistakes, but I think on the whole, there's plenty of blood on the hands of Indian media owners, Indian media editors, and certainly some reporters and journalists and managers.
But isn't it, Pratik and to anybody else, isn't it worse than that, Krishna Prasad? Because credibility is an issue not just in the professional sense, it's an issue in an existential sense, because I think people are coming to power not because of the media, but in spite of the media. Donald Trump it appears, doesn't need the media. Modi, it appears, may or may not. The media might be servile and laying themselves supine before him, but I don't think he bothers about the media. If the middle class media is lambasting him, he can categorize them as a Khan market gang, and you label them in whatever way you like. That same thing is happening with Duterte in the Philippines, or with Erdogan in Turkey, or in Poland, across the board. So we are at a pass where the media is an also ran. If you run with the powers that be, you'll be noticed. Otherwise, you're left behind. And they don't seem to want you. They don't seem to care for you. Because if Donald Trump tweets something in the morning, whether you like it or not, that's the news. That's the headlines. If Modi gets up and tweets something as he does, whether you like it or not, you have to tail that. The social media buzz, you have to tail that. Everybody is monitoring social media and making that their headlines. So haven't things really gone topsy-turvy in a way? And where is the space for this whole holding on to detecting fake news and busting? I'm being devil's advocate for a moment. Busting fake news in this whole scenario.
Well, first let me say, and with all respect, after your comments and your the comments of the last couple of minutes, I'm very depressed. And I'm not as, I choose to take a more optimistic view. I can't speak with the depth and the breadth and the institutional knowledge about Indian journalism the way my esteemed colleagues on the panel can, but I can tell you that there remains a place for journalism. Donald Trump survives precisely because of the media, while at in two ways. Number one, in his first campaign and arguably throughout his presidency, he has, while on one hand, thrived because of the intense news coverage, even negative, what he would view as negative news coverage of him. And on the other hand, he berates the media constantly, calling them enemies of the American people and other derogatory terms. Often at Trump's rallies, violence breaks out, and sometimes journalists are targeted because they're so inflamed and enraged by the president's anti-press freedom rhetoric. On the other hand, I think that journalism still has a vital role to play. Even with citizen journalists, even with the meteoric rise of the influence of social media, even with sites, news sites and news organizations that news organizations in quotes, that intentionally propagate false information. Even with all of that, there is a place in this ecosystem for journalists who are doing their dead level best to seek and report the best obtainable version of the truth. Because without those independent arbiters of what is occurring in society, society itself eventually will crumble. And yes, we live in a very explosive moment in history globally. In the United States, in India, in many of the countries you mentioned, and in others as well. But freedom always dies, to quote the part of the masthead of the Washington Post newspaper, democracy dies in darkness, freedom dies without a free press. Freedom dies without a free press. And call me Pollyannish or what you will, but I continue to believe that, and I see examples of that every day in the United States, and I hope you see them every day here in India.
You're hoping someone will say that. I'm glad you did.
Yes.
I want to make a small point. So I do think that the government needs media and it is using media. It is improper to say that the government doesn't need media and it is achieving what it is achieving in form of propaganda, independent of the media. I don't think that is true. For example, during the elections, I think India Today had a discussion on economy after we had 7 phases of elections, right? 6 phases, right? So India Today.
Seven.
Cover story was after 6.
Yes. So India Today had a discussion on economy and a panel discussion after the 6th phase of the election. Something that should have been discussed before the first phase of election is discussed after the 6th phase. So the government needs media for that. That is not to discuss things. If you look at the media coverage that is happening just yesterday, look at what happened with Shaila Rashid and the media coverage that happened. That is what the government needs to do when auto sector is saying that we are going to lose 10 million jobs. You want to focus on 2 tweets by Shaila Rashid. Yeah. So what is more important, those 2 tweets or 10 million or the job loss of 10 million? So that is what so the government needs media to do bad journalism. That is what government needs media for. Second thing, at this point in time, there are 6 PDF files. There's some good journalism that has come out from Assam as far as NRC is concerned. Indian Express, a lot of journalists have put out what is the ground situation of NRC in Assam. And there are activists who have worked, there are lawyers who have worked. Right now on WhatsApp, there are 6 PDF files which are viral, all in the same font, same colors, everything, which essentially means that there's one organization or one group of individuals who have created all these 6 files. Out of that, one PDF file is dedicated to journalists who are being branded as anti-NRC journalists. All of these journalists are sitting in Assam, and there are various allegations being made against them. Their social media posts are, so it is, I think the PDF file for journalists is like about a 100-page PDF file where the social media posts have put in saying that, look, they are anti-Assam and all of that. So when you have good journalism, that is when Mr. Prasad was speaking about the role of the state, this is what happens. That you have entire machines of propaganda. They create these lists, these Nazi-like lists, and circulate them. And now when you have something as sensitive as the issue of NRC, and there are young journalists who are work, they will obviously get a little afraid that, my name is in a list. You put anybody's name in a list, you'll get afraid. So if there is good journalism, this is how the state acts, but otherwise the state has completely managed how media functions, and it knows the role of, is dictating what role the media should play day in and day out.
And yet it seems to me that there is a credibility disconnect as far as the media is concerned vis-a-vis the public. Why I say this is, for instance, today, for instance, we often hear that we are living in a time of undeclared emergency in India, as against the declared emergency we know of, where again the press was directly under threat, was attacked. We know that newspapers could not publish things, they went to the censors. So some newspapers had to lock down because there was no power connection was disrupted. And yet we could look at even the capital, so-called, press barons standing up to the rights of the press. I remember in college in those days shouting against Mr. Goenka, saying he is a Jude baron, the Jude press of India, down, down. But that man had the guts to oppose Indira Gandhi. I mean, today when I look back, I feel bad that I was shouting against the man. Name one person today, in the big media today, who has the guts to say, this government is wrong and I will take on this government on this policy or that policy. It's a smaller counter media, the online portals, some of them, doing fantastically good stuff, brave stuff. So why? What's happening? Do they believe that there is no problem, that this government has earned the public trust and is pursuing the public interest? Or is it that they're all, it's feet of clay? There is a big paradigm shift, isn't there, Krishna Prasad? In terms of the media, the role of the media as a fourth pillar of democracy, as we call it, the fourth estate is the fourth pillar. Today it looks like the fourth estate is the fifth column of democracy.
Well, you could say that. I think 90% of this audience doesn't know much about the emergency because they were not born then. But to just put them in
I was not born either.
To put them in to put them in 4 bullet points. The emergency was in 1975. The emergency was under Indira Gandhi as Prime Minister. The emergency included something called censorship, which impinged on the freedom of the press in India. But most importantly, the emergency had a start date and an end date. It started on a certain day and ended on a certain day. It was manfully enforced by the Prime Minister of the day through a presidential promulgation. The difference between then and now is this, which is you don't know when it started, you don't know when it will end. There is no formal declaration of this emergency. No president has signed it, and yet, if you look at Kashmir today, newspapers can't be published. Newspapers haven't been published for 14 days, 16 days actually today. For 16 days, some newspapers haven't been published. There have been shutdowns. There have been, reporters can't move around. Reporters can't phone anybody or couldn't phone anybody till Sunday, and again, it's now back to normal. They can't phone anybody. They can't send internet stories on the internet, etc., etc. Presses are closed, etc. The thing is, as you rightly said, there is a huge credibility problem, and the unfortunate part of what's happening is that the so-called national consensus which was there against Indira Gandhi's emergency seems to have crumbled in this phase of the undeclared emergency. And I'm not at all surprised that the Indian Express opposed the emergency then, is doing nothing now, because the forces that the Indian Express was opposed to at that time are the forces that are in power today. So I'm not at all surprised, and I am not going to shock anybody by saying that the connect between the right wing in this country and the Indian Express in certain ways is pretty obvious, is on record. So I think for that reason alone, you don't see any opposition. You don't see any opposition because the corporate ownership of media in this country is huge, huge. So which means that Mukesh Ambani, who's the country's richest man, also owns 43 television news channels. So if he does something, his business interests are endangered. One of India's richest men, within the top 25, of this within the top 25 richest people in this country, cried before me when his empire was threatened, because he said, this is not something I can afford. So therefore, there's a huge difference between what happened during Indira Gandhi's emergency and now. You now have a more lethal, more insidious, more merciless kind of approach, which is undeclared, undemocratic, and brutal. And so therefore, you don't see the opposition you should be seeing. But that said, forget the media. Where is the political opposition? Have you seen, except today, I think in Delhi, have you seen a single protest march in which Rahul Gandhi or Sonia Gandhi or DMK or PMK or any party you can think of where they have led 1 lakh people? Have you seen protests in Hong Kong day before yesterday morning? Look at the protests in Hong Kong against Chinese efforts, and look at the efforts in India against what's happening in Kashmir. It takes wild horses to get our industry bodies to talk about what's happening. You know, they are so arrogant, some of these media bodies, some of their chiefs are so arrogant, they don't even respond to emails. So where is the question here? It's now come to our individual consciences. Do we have the conscience to speak up? Do we have the courage to speak up regardless of what's going to happen? Or are we just going to be cowardly and sit in a corner saying, oh, this is good, Hinduism is doing great, Hindutva is wonderful, you know, we need a bit of dictatorship, or look at the Chinese model. Are we going to be okay with that? Or are we going to find the feet to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to take this? I think that is the difference that has emerged. And I think there's a huge, I mean, I'm sorry to go drag on this, but I think there's a huge propulsion of forces which we are unable to recognize behind all that's happening. And I personally would place it at the doorstep of Hindutva, you know, an inherent in Hindutva which has been there in most people's hearts, which okays all this. Either it is fear or this. So I think there's too much at play, and you know, we can talk endlessly about this, but the truth is that I think we have really been lacking between 75 and now. There's a huge difference.
The reason why Krishna Prasad touched on that as he was talking about this, why the press may be less significant, or the connect with the public may be less important, is because of the corporatization of the press, the big media. I think Robert McChesney spoke about this, the rich media, poor democracy. Then, speaking to this is the experience of the United States, where you've had salutary kind of, policies like cross-media restrictions, cross-media ownership restrictions on those. In India, unfortunately, we've never had that. So we've had, cartels and oligopolies in the media sector. Do you think that would be a big structural shift? And how would you then, the days you've been in India, how would you characterize the difference that you see in terms of the vibrancy of the media in the United States and the lack of that, in one sense, in India? I just want to add this rider because when Trump was becoming president, in the run-up to the presidency, I think roughly about 20 media organizations were with Trump and about 200 were against him. Post-Trump's election, that equation hasn't changed, as far as I can see. Most of the media continue to criticize Trump. He, of course, hits back as good as they give it to him. But in India, you'll find just the opposite. Once Modi is the prime minister, or even the lead up to that, everybody is kind of supplicating themselves before the prime minister. So there's a big difference in that.
Well, one of the fundamental tenets of journalism in the United States is the ability to speak truth to power. And that has become, instead of a force for good in the minds of several million Americans today, it's now a force of evil because of the president's anti-free press rhetoric. Because 40 to 50% of the American people at any given time will believe anything the president says, regardless of how outrageous it may be, and that includes subscribing to the notion that the press are the enemy of the people. And about 50 to 60% will disbelieve anything he says, and those numbers don't budge very much very often. I will tell you that in the United States, there has been a deterioration of trust in media, and I believe one of the principal causes of that is the conflation of opinion media with responsible journalism. The three main cable news networks in the United States all have responsible journalists who work for them. They also have opinion hosts who will take selective parts of the journalism that is performed by the real responsible journalists of their network. Just those parts of the journalism that tend to support their preconceived notions about what's occurring, and they get an entire hour on their cable network to use selected portions of that journalism to espouse their personal opinions. And often the public gets confused by that, by the conflation of what the opinion media personalities are saying and what the journalists are saying. So one of the things I do as I travel around the United States is to caution people who work in the business, the news media business, and caution members of the general public that you can't be tribal and you can't just get your news from one source. You have to expose yourself to a variety of sources. And I would say, based on my limited experience as a consumer of the news media here in India, that the same is very much true here. I mean, on Sunday evening alone, my first day in India on this trip, I saw 5 or 6 English language all news channels discussing the Kashmir situation. And some were so obviously pro-Modi and and anti-Pakistan and supportive of what's occurring in Kashmir, and a couple were just the opposite. And it was so obvious to me, and it reminded me of this Fox News MSNBC issue in the United States. Only, I must tell you, when it comes to flashy graphics and sensationalism and everything's breaking news, you guys have really won that contest. I think in India, in the United States, and many other countries around the world, we're seeing less and less of the balanced, responsible journalism and more attention paid to the opinion media personalities and what they have to say.
I was actually looking for an answer because the question was, so we, as he pointed out, that there's a problem. You said that, in the US, a lot of journalists speak truth to power. I'm sure a lot of journalists in India would want to as well, but they are unable to. And there's a problem as far as the business model is concerned. We know that there's a lot of lobbying in the US. So I think one of the questions that remains unanswered is, how is it that, let's say, a New York Times or a Washington Post is not being influenced by the corporates as corporates are influencing media organizations in India? What is different?
Well, in the United States, as a journalism entity with a couple of pronounced exceptions, journalism is a business as well as a public service. And there is a very hard line, although sometimes it moves, so it's hard to say what happened, what is true today in this regard was true 5 years ago or 5 days ago. But there is a line between journalism and advertising. I respect tremendously the fact that you don't take advertising because that helps position you as an impartial arbiter of what is the truth and what isn't. But I also believe that you can take advertising and you can have sponsors and still be responsible journalists. And in the United States, since the broadcast business was deregulated about 40 years ago now, nearly 40 years ago now, it used to be in the broadcast space that broadcasters were required by the United States government to spend X percentage of their broadcast time on news and public affairs programming. And then in 1983, under President Reagan, the Federal Communications Commission did away with that regulation. And that is what led to the proliferation of bias talk radio and things like Fox News, even though the FCC doesn't regulate cable television directly. But there's still, while that's going on, there's still a lot of responsible journalism that is advertising supported and does serve at the local level communities all across the country, and on the national level serves the nation as a whole. And by and large, with some exceptions and with room for improvement, right? It's not perfect.
Right.
By and large, America is much better off because we have a free press and a variety of voices and a variety of points of view that are expressed on a variety of platforms.
Free press that's constitutionally enshrined, the First Amendment.
The very First Amendment of our Constitution.
Well, Shashi, your question as to why the Indian media has crumbled and changed and why the Americans have not, seemingly, I think is answered by this last point, which is that America has something called the First Amendment. America was founded on July 4th, 1776, and on July 5th, the next day was the First Amendment, which covers the media with a blanket. So there's a blanket freedom that the media enjoys in America, which protects the media. But the key factor between India and the United States is institutions. Despite everything mad that Mr. Trump says, the truth is that the institutions in America have stood up. The courts have stood up, the media has stood up, and all manner of organizations and sectors of industry have stood up. In this country, we have a huge issue, which is an issue which is really immeasurable, where the institutions have crumbled along with the media. For example, last week, Anuradha Bhasin, the executive editor of the Kashmir Times, Anuradha Bhasin, she petitioned the Supreme Court of India saying that this internet lockdown, which has prevented her newspaper from coming out, should be lifted. In 1975, 76, 77, the Supreme Court of India had the strength to stand up. I would invite many of you to go and look up a case called the habeas corpus case, Habeas Corpus, habeas corpus case, where a single judge of the Supreme Court called H.R. Khanna, a completely unremarkable man, had the strength to contest all his other colleagues on the bench of the Supreme Court and say that Indira Gandhi was wrong, and he restored the fundamental rights of the citizen. On the other hand, in 2019, last week, when an editor of a newspaper says, please allow me to print my newspaper, the Supreme Court does not have the strength to speak up. So our institutions have crumbled, our industry has crumbled, we have nothing called the police, we have nothing called the CBI, we have nothing called the Enforcement Directorate. Everything is a handmaiden of the government of the day, to the extent that our media bodies, whether it's the Editors Guild of India, whether it's the Press Council of India, whether it is the Indian Newspaper Society, all of them are complicit either in their participation or in their silence at what's happening. I think that's a very big difference between India and the United States, and that's where I will stop.
Right, so I think that's...
Also, one last point. We seem to say in this thesis, in this premise for this panel discussion, that we are talking about editorial leadership in an age of disinformation. I will just say this much. There is an oversupply of one and a scary scarcity of the other. You decide which one we have too much of and which one we have too little of.